And the editor of this particular book. As I say, this is a little bit of an experiment and a very different project for Comma compared to previous work that we've done. It's a bit of a stretch to with something like superhero fiction and comic book kind of narratives as a literary press. But the origins of the book are really, you know, as a kid growing up, I loved superhero films in particular and comic books, but I loved the initial, the early Tim Burton Batman, for instance. But I found that I loved it, or I wanted to love it more than I actually could. There was always something missing with the superhero narratives. There was the kinds of stories that the superhero canon engaged with. There was a focus on petty crime and a very sort of, there's a very limited definition of what the small guy was, and ultimately, you know, or very, very quickly, even as a teenager, you realize that the superheroes in the American canon are largely just enforcers of the law, fighters of petty crime, enforcers of the status quo. They're essentially policemen or worse, vigilantes. And I always wondered what a political superhero would look like, a superhero that fought kind of structural or social injustices rather than petty crime. And it was just an idle thought until a few years ago, I was working on a project called Resist, which is another book about the history of British protest. And I came upon a tradition which opened up this as a possibility, this idea of the politicized superhero. And this was, initially it was the discovery of the story of the Rebecca riots in 1839 and again in 1843 in South Wales. There was a series of riots or protests against the use of toll booths, toll gates on roads, which local villagers had to pay to use. And there was a series of protests where the local villagers, the men, would dress up as this character called Rebecca, and one would be appointed to be the lead Rebecca and the other would be Rebecca's followers. And they would march off to the local, the nearest toll gate in the middle of the night. And before they did anything, they would a script, a short kind of to and fro, a dialogue between Rebecca and her followers. And then they would go about smashing the toll gate up. And it was a very peculiar kind of collective action. And the historian involved in that particular project with me, Rhiann Jones, identified that kind of protest as what she called Rebeccaism. And it soon became apparent that there's a whole tradition in British protest history leading up to about 1840s of political movements and sort of people's history, people power movements gathering around collective identities, shared names, shared aliases, and a performative kind of protest. Both with, you know, in terms of dressing up and adopting a shared identity, but also the use of pseudonyms and aliases to hide behind. The early 19th century, the Luddites gathered under this kind of semi-fictional leader called General Ludd. The swing riots took place were carried out under the name of a leader, a fictional leader called Captain Swing, and so forth. And there were much older ones, the Midland Rising, the Western Rising, and so forth. And they all had a kind of fictional character at the top of them, but it was a shared identity. So what I did with this book is I gave all of the writers a list of these names and asked them to pick one and transplant this historical figurehead into the present day and give them superpowers and give them a kind of political cause, a contemporary political cause. So Tonight, we're delighted to be joined by three of the writers on this project. I'm absolutely bowled over by the quality of the writing and the selection of the writers that said yes to this project. Tonight, we're going to hear from three of them, Lisa Luxx, Divya Ghelani, and Luan Goldie. Just to introduce each of them first, Luan Goldie is a Glasgow-born author and primary school teacher who grew up in East London. Her debut novel, Nightingale Point, was longlisted for the 2020 Women's Prize for Fiction and the Royal Society of Literature Untitled Prize. It was also a BBC Radio 2 Joe Wiley Book Club pick. In 2018, she won the Costa Short Story Award, and her short stories have since appeared in Hello, Sunday Express, and The Good Journal. Her second novel, Homecoming, was released by HarperCollins in 2020. Divya Ghelani holds an MA in creative writing from the University of East Anglia and an MPhil in literary studies from the University of Hong Kong. Her short stories have been published by Bearlit, Litero, Comma, BBC Radio 4 and other places. Her novel In Progress has been longlisted and shortlisted for 4 literary awards. She currently lives in Berlin, where she leads a BIPOC reading series for the Reader Berlin and co-hosts a short story club for the UK's leading literary salon, The Word Factory. And finally, we have Lisa Luxx. Lisa is an activist and poet of British and Syrian heritage. Her poems have been published in The Telegraph, The London Magazine, and by publishers such as Hachette and Saki Books. Her work has been broadcast on Channel 4, BBC Radio 4, TEDx, and other places. And in 2021, she toured UK theatres with the show for her 60-minute poem, Eating the Copper Apple, produced by a team of all Arab women artists. She's the founder of the Sisterhood Salon in Beirut and works within an economy of sisterhood. Her debut book, Fetch Your Mother's Heart, is out now from Outspoken Press. So we're going to start with Luan, primarily because Luan's story opens the book, and it was one of the first stories to come back when we set the commission out. Luan's going to read a short extract from it, and then I'm going to talk to her a little bit about her character and her thinking. So please welcome, I'd say put your hands together, but this is online. Please welcome Luan Goldie.
My story is called Pause, and it plays with time. So it's set in the modern day, but it plays with time in sort of a short sense. I'm going to read the opening of it, where you get to meet these two characters, these two sisters, and one's quite politically engaged, and she's trying to get her younger sister to feel the same way. Izzy and I walk around where the Park Cafe used to be. It's still there, of course, hidden behind the wooden hoardings the council put up last month after the old building was broken into. It was the third time it had been vandalised, the windows smashed, the walls sprayed with crude depictions of Mayor Thomas stuffing the pockets of his tacky purple suit with handfuls of cash. As a kid, I used to hate that the cafe had so many windows. The whole front of it was glass, and Dad used to inspect each pane for fingerprints, evidence that I hadn't cleaned it as well as he'd liked. If we can't keep our windows clean, people will think our kitchen's not clean either, he'd say. Though Dad's kitchen at the cafe was always spotless. Everything around Dad was spotless, cleanliness being one of the few things he had control over in his life. Izzy climbs on a bench and tries to see over the hoardings. It's a mess in there, she says. Get down, I tell her. Her black pleated school skirt flies up as she jumps back, igniting a cheer from the drug dealers who occupy the opposite park bench. I say, was that really necessary? She shrugs and plucks at the long grass. The council used to keep it cut. Even after they stopped opening the public toilets and fixing equipment in the swing park, the grass was at least kept below knee length. I guess they no longer need to pretend to care. It's not a park anymore, just some sketchy bit of land, a neglected eyesore, nothing worth fighting for. I hope people turn up tomorrow, Izzy says, as she steps towards the hoardings and taps at one of the remaining posters. It'd been a challenge keeping the posters up, the council being so quick to tear them down, as if peaceful protest was no longer allowed. I even had a call from one of Mayor Thomas's aides asking me to reconsider my plan. You won't be making a scene, will you? The aide asked me. To which I replied, yes, that's my entire objective. It'll be so embarrassing if nobody comes to your protest, Izzy says, especially with all this effort you've gone to. You know it's meant to be baking hot as well tomorrow. I'm looking to get a tan, she says, checking the colour of her arms, which are 2 shades lighter than the dark orange of her face. I make a conscious effort to stop grinding my teeth, to stop taking her disinterest so personally. She checks her reflection in the screen of her phone. I get why you're doing the whole cross-dressing thing, she says, but you're going to sweat buckets in that ugly suit. Why don't you just wear a dress instead? You know, sex it up a little bit. But tomorrow's not about being sexy. It's about humiliating Mayor Thomas. People used to be dazzled by his expensive suits and his talk loaded with promises. But things are changing. People around here are ready for a more honest leader, someone in tune with the community. Too bad they didn't want all this when Dad was here, the perfect candidate. Izzy, did you tell your friends from school to come along tomorrow? I ask, thinking of the slightly rowdy yet large group of girls Izzy spends most of her time with. Yeah, kind of. Well, they're busy, you know. They're 15, Izzy. What could they possibly be busy doing? Going Westfield? She says. And I see that longing in her eyes, the one that threatens to pull her away from me and what she increasingly sees as my causes. Of course, she doesn't want to waste her Saturdays being politically engaged. She'd much rather spend hours trying on clothes she'll never buy and eat at McDonald's. But we were never brought up to be those kinds of girls. We spent our childhoods giving out leaflets on the high street and wearing C&D badges and marching as soon as we could walk. Though looking at my sister now, you wouldn't think it.
Thank you, Luan. So your character is Lady Skimmington, who was originally the kind of the figurehead of what was a series of protests called the Western Rising, which were anti-enclosure riots that took place between 1626 and 1632 in various kind of forests, Forest of Dean, Forest of Gillingham, Braden Forest, in places like Wiltshire and Dorset. And it was very much a sort of a protest around access to public land and the use of common land. And I wondered why it was that you picked that particular cause and that particular character, and how you went about transplanting it into the present day and making it relevant to kind of your concerns as well, your interests as well.
Well, I liked quite a lot of them that were sent over on the original list, and quite a few of them were similar as well. The idea of having this figurehead character, which lots of people take the name and the character of. But this one, I thought that sounds really interesting, just because I didn't know much. I mean, everyone knows about the Rebecca Riots. I was watching Horrible Histories with my little girl recently, and then she learned about the Rebecca Riots from that, you know. But Lady Skimmington, it's just such a funny name, and I was really drawn to it. And when I started speaking to Rianne about the history of it, I was super interested. I wanted to have the characters, these two sisters, one who was really politically engaged and really cared about her community and how it was changing, and then the other sister who's a bit younger and not quite interested. I wanted that conflict between them. I just thought it made it more realistic. I mean, there's lots of teenagers that are hugely politically engaged, but there's a lot that are like Izzy in the story that do just want to go to Westfield and try on clothes and have fun and pretend like it's not happening. So I really wanted to show that in the story.
And how did the conversations with the historian kind of go? Because you worked with Rianne E. Jones yourself. So how did you incorporate what you kind of learned about the original character in your story? Well,
she sent me over a few things to read, which was really helpful. And she sent me over as well some links to paintings, sort of interpretations of Lady Skimmington, which were great. But I remember when we had one of our conversations, and it was during one of the lockdowns, and we're both quite fired up about local parks and like how much we were using the local parks, and all of a sudden we felt really protective over them. And I do wonder if we would have had that conversation another time, how different it would have been, and if the story would have been different. Because it was that point, remember, where we were like, really, everybody was appreciating their local park, even if you have a garden. I mean, I've got a little garden here in London, but my local park, which before lockdown I thought was quite shit, I'm going to be honest, because it's not always that well looked after, and there are always a little group of drug dealers or people you don't want to hang out with. I didn't love the park, but during that lockdown, I was like, wow, the park is everything. It's where I see everyone. It's where everything's going on now. And she was the same when I spoke to her. We're talking about little community parks or even little scrappy bits of green lands that, you know, the other side of the estate, and how much we really started valuing them. And then we're thinking back to the history of these risings, and that all the people were having their land sort of taken away from them, even though it wasn't their land, they didn't own it, but it was their space that they were so used to using and having access to, and then all of a sudden it was being pulled away from them. We're thinking, gosh, the space, this outdoor space is so important, and we easily take it for granted. So I wanted to get that across in the story as well.
Yeah, there was an amazing sense of timeliness when that story came in. Obviously, it was, as I say, it's the beginning of the lockdown, and I remember yours and Courtier's stories were the two stories which came in first and were absolutely of the moment. Although they didn't talk about the pandemic directly, and I don't think any of the stories talked about the pandemic sort of directly. It kind of marks that the impression, you know, it's testimony to that reevaluation and that kind of reprioritizing of what's important to communities. So I'm now going to hand over to Divya. Divya Ghelani is going to read an extract from her stories, which is about a group of characters called the M&Ms.
Hi everyone. So yeah, my name's Divya, and my British superhero story, The M&Ms, is about a teenage boy, a British South Asian teenage boy called Riots, who lives in Ashby de la Zouch. And when we meet him, he's feeling really hurt and depressed and powerless because his best friend, Martin Marprelate, has been deported to Jamaica, and he feels like he can't do anything about it. So he's in this position where he's shouting at the TV, and the Prime Minister's talking, and he realizes that he can read his mind. So that's where I'm going to start from. The M&Ms. Virat paced about his living room, his fists clenched in anger. Good Morning Britain was coming live from outside Downing Street. The Prime Minister was talking about his party's British Values Initiative, which he was launching with a fanfare of subsidiary announcements, a new set of bank holidays, Winston Churchill Day, Empire Day, and so on, to replace the old, successfully distracting coverage from another part of the same initiative, a series of immigration raids and deportation flights, including one just that morning from Heathrow. The PM's comms team had judged the wider British Values Initiative to be on point with traditional older voters, and gimmicks like the new bank holidays as sufficiently vacuous to divide and distract the younger ones. In the weeks before this morning's launch, they had deployed new algorithms to focus group its talking points, keywords, slogans, and even its logo across the whole gamut of social media platforms. We've sent another round of criminals packing, replied the PM to a question about deportations in his usual faux colloquial tone. Each one of them has committed heinous crimes, forfeiting their right to remain in our great nation. Today's flight contains 35 murderers, 59 paedophiles, as well as tax dodgers, countless drug dealers, and in all cases, COVID-19 protocol violations. You lot are psychos, Virat yelled at the TV. Mobster was just smoking a spliff in Prescott Park. Everyone does it. So what if he doesn't have a birth certificate? He got framed to meet your numbers. Virat took a few deep breaths to stop from shaking. His best friend, Martin Marprelate, didn't even know the country he was being sent to. He was just a baby when he left Jamaica. He was from nowhere but right here, Ashby de la Zouch. That's where Marps belonged. Losing him to a vote-grabbing scheme had affected Virat's mental health. Since they took Martin, he'd had stomach pains, headaches, and an inability to focus on anything his friends said. And when they did speak to him, his anguish made him close his eyes and watch their words swirl together. He told his college therapist about it, who suggested, It might be hypervigilance born of trauma. A lot of non-white kids are experiencing this thanks to the ruling party's relentless jingoistic rhetoric. He'd recommended Virat and his mother visit their GP to get a prescription for antidepressants. But since the NHS had introduced increased prescription fees, Mrs. Palmer could no longer afford certain aspects of healthcare. Now, as the PM rattled off more of his familiar responses, a strange new headache coursed through Virat's head. With his eyes closed, Virat could feel the Prime Minister's xenophobic words spiraling through the darkness. "What is wrong with you?" Virat muttered. "Why don't you listen to us? For once in your life, why don't you just shut up and listen?" Just then, the Prime Minister paused, lifted his hand to his forehead and blinked for a moment at the cameras. "You," he pointed to one of the reporters. "Did you say something to me?" The reporter shook his head. Red-faced, the PM straightened his jacket. "Sorry, folks," the Prime Minister told the TV viewers, clearing his throat and jiggling his earpiece. "I could have sworn. Anyway, as I was saying, today is a momentous day. This initiative will bring a message of confidence, positivity, and hope to millions of Britons amidst these times of apprehension." As the Prime Minister continued and his words swirled in the darkness of Virat's thoughts, the teenager became aware of a subtle and more insidious voice behind them. It was the PM's inner voice. "You're really buying this, aren't you?" it said. "Come on then, drink the Kool-Aid, you bunch of illiterate sheep. There's plenty more where that came from." As the contemptuous inner voice continued to play behind the Prime Minister's spoken words, Virat Palmer began to see just how little any of the PM's utterances meant to him. "Not everyone's going to buy this bullshit," Virat thought. "Not everyone is going to buy this bullshit," the Prime Minister suddenly parroted to the array of cameramen and photographers. Virat stared at the TV screen. Did he actually just say that? Must have been a coincidence, he told himself. And yet, the words he could now see turning through the darkness also came with memories attached. Ideas, recollections, fears, and fantasies. It was strange. One minute, he was a 17-year-old Indian kid with a bad GTA 6 habit living in Ashby de la Zouch. The next, he's recollecting playing Pyramus in an all-Latin production of Ovid in the New Hall in Eton. "Prime Minister, that was an alarming statement," a BBC journalist shouted from the press pack on the other side of the street. "Would you care to elaborate?"
I don't know which Prime Minister that could be based on. I would hate to say or specify. Well, it's amazing hearing that and thinking about that text and that immigration policy in the current context that of the last 2 weeks and this sudden 180 kind of in our attitudes towards refugees. But just to rewind a little bit before we get to that hypocrisy. Divya, why did you choose this character? So this character is based on a series of letters that were written in the early 1590s under the pseudonym, or all apparently written by a character called Martin Marprelate. That was a criticism, a kind of a satirical criticism of the Church of England at the time, and led to, I think, 3 potential writers being hanged or accused writers being hanged. But why did you pick Martin Marprelate as a kind of as a figurehead here?
So I was just really fascinated in the history when you gave me that list of characters, and I really was quite interested in the history, because it was a pamphlet war in the 1500s. It became a war of words, and the Protestants, the Protestant activists who were writing these tracts against the Church of England, they were writing satirical pieces. They were writing books of jests. They were being very playful with language. And so as a writer, that, of course, that really appealed to me. And the idea that the government became so scared about the following that they amassed because of their talent, so much that they had to hire their own writers to write counter tracts. And it became this war of words, or what Ariel Hessein calls paper bullets, was just really really interesting to me. I didn't know how I was going to put it into a short story, but it certainly piqued my interest in more ways. And I began to wonder how, you know, you might do a modern rendering of this. And obviously those characters in the 1500s were, sorry, those historical figures, they were, you know, fighting against the church. And obviously the church has not as much power as it used to, especially in Britain. And so I decided to go for the government.
And what was the research process like? I mean, talking to Ariel, what bits did you sort of want to bring out and relocate in the present day, and what did you need to change?
So the research process with Ariel, I mean, we just had one meeting and it was quite lengthy, and then I was very intimidated by his intellect, so I just went off and just read all the pieces instead of having to contact him again. But I was really interested in the idea of authorship and anonymity. Martin Marprelate tracts, as you were saying earlier, it was a collection of people under one name, and the real author. There was much discussion about that, so I wanted to put that in my story, and I think I managed to do that. I was also interested in the notion that you can kill people, but not an idea. And that became the grand theme of my story. So in my story, you know, important characters do get killed, but the idea takes, you know, sets fire among the people. So that was something that was already in the Martin Marprelate history. Yeah, and as I said, I was interested in what Ariel Hessein called paper bullets, this kind of use of satire, comedy, jest, books, ballads, well-informed anecdotes to you know, fire at your enemy. And then that, you know, after conversations with you, Ra, became very clear that the kind of the modern rendering of that would be through these teenage boys using memes, using blogs, using, you know, yeah, kind of anything they could, you know, that to creatively protest, to find new ways of protesting that would activate the people, and in ways that would not just mean that they passively consume, but that they themselves become politicized.
And there's we'll talk about the current context later. And by the way, if anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat. But I was just very interested in why you chose, without giving away the ending, despite your character's superpower, sorry, he doesn't prevail particularly. He ends up, you know, incarcerated and etc. etc. And I wonder why you chose that route rather than kind of a heroic victory.
Well, I was actually really nervous about writing this within my story, because, you know, I'm really aware of the politics in a lot of blockbuster stories of characters of color getting killed off. And so I was really hyper aware of that, and I wasn't sure that was the way I wanted to go. And yet it seemed to be really important that these characters died, but the idea doesn't die, because that adheres to the history, but also it's a very powerful message. And it's the two central characters. There's one is Black and one is a South Asian, both are teenagers. So it's heartbreaking, but the people take up their cause. And so it's a bittersweet ending. There you go. I told everyone the ending.
Not in detail, not in detail. Sorry, it's me that started. So yeah, we'll now move on to Lisa. Lisa, do you want to read a little extract from your story?
Yes, I would love to. That was awesome, by the way, Divya. I really loved that, both of you. So I'll jump straight into reading from this. The story is called Mothers Need Mothers, and focuses on single mothers in the working class in Huddersfield. So a couple of things you need to know about this extract. I'm going into kind of the middle of the story here, and I'm going into the origin story here. Shapeshifting is the superpower of Lexi, who is our main character. Her baby is Ethan. And when I say the group in this extract, that refers to the Women's Centre, a local grassroots organisation where there is a made-up, the Women's Centre is real, but there's a made-up session in this story, which is where mothers go to look after each other's children to allow one another to go out and do jobs. So I think that's all the information you need to try and make sense of what I'm about to share. Ethan jolted into action after bath time, smelling of bubblegum flavoured bowl bath and waving his bum around. He ran from room to room, throwing a sticky alien at every wall until it lost its stickiness and he burst into his usual dramatics. Typical. He had been placid all day in the presence of others, but as soon as she had him alone, he went haywire. It was through the Mothers Need Mothers group that she had learned it was normal to lose your cool and scream and beg to your child, "Why do you hate me?" and then become flushed with shame. A shame that for months sends a chill through you like rigor mortis. It was through the group that Lexi had found a way out of that pattern and had stopped taking it so personally. Ethan slept around 2:30 a.m. His tan, resting face and wet mouth looked so soft as Lexi whispered half sentences, delirious from exhaustion, and the sum of each sentence's parts seemed to be, "I will never leave you." She pushed the safety net more tightly against the side of the bed and quietly, as her eyes adjusted to the dark, rummaged through the drawer under their bed for 2 flimsy photo albums. The fairy lights draped around the dresser dimly illuminated the photographs, but it was enough. She found who she was looking for, who she was always looking for. Not her mother, never her mother, no. She barely dared to think about the mother who couldn't. This was the woman who had raised Lexi from the age of 2 until 11, the first woman she ever morphed into. The same day, Jamie Harris, with his blonde highlights and straightened emo hair, said, "No wonder your parents didn't want you. You look like a mangled bird." She had skipped maths and sat in the top fields, willing herself to run away. By the time she returned to school, her foster mother was looking exhausted in the principal's office, and she would have been summoned in as legal guardian. "Why can't you just pretend to be my mother?" she thought, staring through the glass. It was when her never mother looked back that she felt, for the first time, the black hole opening in the center of her chest, an intense suction, followed by a tingling rush of release as every cell in turn switched over. Lexi was, in less than a second, not Lexi anymore. She ran through the corridor towards the art department's always empty toilet stalls and stopped in front of the mirror, panting and hovering a shaking hand over the beads around her new old neck. This is how she disappeared twice in one day. Once to hide herself, the second time to hide who she had accidentally become. And this was the straw that broke the camel's back. She was sentenced to a pupil referral unit for falling below mainstream school standards because mainstream school standards were only invented for children in secure homes. As a wayward teenager, she would more and more often look strangers in the eye and wonder if they were family, if she could will them into being family. And that was how the gift grew, shape-shifting into strangers, mirroring folk to convince herself she was exactly like them, that she belonged to someone, to something other than the emptiness. Her foster mother couldn't accept housing a child in a PIU, and nobody knew her secret gift. All they saw was her obvious failing as a student. It was a Thursday, her final day in that house, in that family, before the social services lady with her stupid mint green car turned up in the driveway. She was rushed out and passed on to foster home after foster home after foster home through her next 7 years until she had to find her own feet at 18. Each home only strengthened her gift. Each home was a current carrying her further away from her source, from any hope of ever knowing her real mother. All she was ever told was, your mother couldn't cope, so she gave you up. Her birth mother was poor. Her birth mother had lived with her in a mother and baby shelter. Her birth mother was struggling with postpartum depression. Her birth mother lost her baby because the system does not support poor single mothers. In truth, she was Lexi's greatest fear, standing at her elbow every time Lexi breastfed Ethan. An absence so vast and wide it threatened to seep into any crack that formed between Lexi and her son, to seep in, to surge and rush and thunder as a river becomes an ocean, tearing them apart. She slept a shallow sleep, with Ethan on one side of her and the photo album on the other, the fairy lights changing patterns throughout the hours of the night.
Thank you, Lisa. That's amazing. Thank you very much. So, same question to you, but you know, why did you pick that particular character? In your case, Lexi is part of the group that you refer to is a group that called themselves the Servants of the Fairy, the Queen of the Fairies, which was a poacher riot, a phrase that I've not heard before, and I think it's a very rare thing. It's 130 poachers just invaded a country estate in Penshurst in Kent in 1450, and captured loads of the animals, and those that were arrested all gave, instead of giving their real name, they gave the name the Servants of the Queen of the Fairies. Not much is known about why they did that or what was the thinking behind that. But I'm curious as to why you chose that, and also I'm fascinated by the fact that you've got a superhero here with superpowers, and what you chose to talk about was stealing a group of people that stole or repossessed things like nappies and baby formula and gave them to food banks and single mothers groups. It's the opposite of the usual world-saving shenanigans of the superhero. It's incredibly local and incredibly kind of modest in terms of its ambitions. What was your thinking behind all that?
Yeah, so the first part of the question, the reason why I like this story is because it's this group, and it's predominantly working class men who stormed this you know, this land of the upper class and took these resources and this sustenance, which was these animals and what these animals could give and provide. And they dressed up in drag. These men, they dressed up as women, and I was interested in that and in who is kind of convicted for crime. And so the women in this group, because there is more than one. Lexi, I'm not going to call her the leader. What I found so interesting about these collective identities is that there's something inherently feminist in not having a singular leader. But actually having these collectives that go unnamed, and there's many examples of that kind of in current activist circles where people aren't named particularly, but they have a collective identity. And so I really like this idea, and so I had my women drag up as men. So it was essentially always men who were getting done for these crimes, and I was sorry, my brain's going like 5 different directions because I'm quite excited to be talking about this finally. It's been such a long time since conception. So the women, what they do, like you say, they focus on resources for other single mothers. At the time, I knew a lot of women, a lot of single mothers who were ending up at food banks and who had at one point been the women who were working in such services, guiding other women to food banks, and suddenly they were finding themselves in the queue next to the women they'd once been assisting. And you know, in my own activist work, I focus a lot on resources for mothers and for single mothers who are living below poverty lines, or who have little to no access to rights. And I know how, you know, we can look at the big world and changing the big world. And I feel like that's an ambition from a very globalized, you know, and let's call globalization what it is, which is Americanization, a very Americanized view of domination still, you know, whereas when you focus on this locality and these small worlds that are massive to the people, you know, within them, that can be your whole world. You know, getting nappies for that day can be your whole world. Is that not world enough? You know, so I really wanted to focus on these seemingly micro, but actually when you're within it, incredibly macro experiences. And
what was the for you? What was the research process like when you were working with a historian, Carl Griffin? What did you get from those conversations, and what were you able to bring to the present, and what did you have to change?
Yeah, so there was a fair bit that I changed in terms of, I mean, obviously as we have to in terms of application, because we wanted these to be very modern, very current, very readable today, and applicable to the life we know. But the essence and the drive behind this kind of class war, behind this lack of direct access to resources, and that ultimately being this, you know, the mantra of capitalism is born from our lack of access to our own resource and sustenance. So Carl gave me very interesting insight into all of that. And then what I tried to do is actually step back from it and just let its ideas and its politics germinate in my mind. And then I conducted research separately I interviewed my sister, who's a working class single mother, and who this character is largely based on, let's say, which she's very excited about. And then I also did a interview with the local women's centre in Huddersfield, because I do work very closely with them, and with their mothers, with their birth mothers and what have you. So I took on my own research. So I had my research with Carl, and then I took on my own research in terms of really understanding what put these groups, these grassroots collectives, organisations and individuals at threat at this current moment, because I wanted that to fuel, you know, the conversations that were happening in the book between the characters and the characters themselves. Thanks.
I'm going to open it out now, just generally to all three of you, you know, and whoever wants to go first, please jump in. But what was is writing a superhero story, a short story about a superhero, that different to writing any other kind of story? Was there were any of you kind of a little bit trepidatious about this as a genre?
I found it really difficult, actually, because I think with superheroes, I'm not a huge superhero fan, but I'll engage with it as far as like watching a Marvel film or something. So as far as like reading about superheroes, when it came to me actually sitting and writing about a superhero, like an origin story, I was quite stuck. So something I thought, oh, I could do this. The hardest part would be grasping the history and getting the ideas. It was the superhero bit that I was kind of stumped by, just because I hadn't read origin stories, and you know, I write about normal everyday situations, and then I was writing this sort of, well, I think at the start I thought I have to write something quite fantastical and extraordinary, and then trying to bring it back down to just being about people and the relationships and how we try and look out for each other. So I found it really, really difficult. But I don't know what your experiences were, if you found it hard or if you sort of were bursting to write your superheroes, but I really struggled at the start.
I thought it was going to be very hard, actually. I've got to say, I was quite intimidated by the task at first. I mean, Common Press, right? You've been so supportive since conception, but I was incredibly intimidated by it. And then what I found it was a very beautiful way into exploring kind of, I don't know, themes that I would otherwise be quite polemical about, or otherwise kind of be very overtly political about. and through this kind of like masking, if you like, you know, to use that visual purposefully, through this, it kind of allowed me in through the side door of these political statements that I was making. So I actually found that quite exciting, and I found it quite moving to write this story. And I also didn't have much experience of them, but I think through kind of this, through learning more and more about the roots of kind of superhero and superheroes and folktale and their kind of, you know, anti-capitalist, anti-state activism. You know, I came to understand more and more the dominant Hollywood narratives of superheroes and just what kind of propaganda that is. I've spent all week like reporting all of the Marvel adverts on Twitter as political propaganda, just to celebrate our book being released.
So for me, yeah, as well, I was very nervous. I think Ra had said, oh, do you want to write a story for Common Press? And here are some ideas of different types of stories that you could write. And I was like, oh, anything, throw anything. I like a challenge. And then I was like, then I picked superheroes, or it was offered to me, and then I was quite flummoxed and quite overwhelmed. You know, growing up, I have a twin brother, and growing up, we watched a lot of superhero stories together. You know, we read Alan Moore, and we were quite engaged, but I was only a very passive consumer of all of these things, and I never saw myself as writing a superhero myself. So my creative beginning was my brother and his friends. You know, Ashby de la Zouch is not far from Loughborough, where I grew up. So I just imagined this like band of it was quite fun to kind of play in that area, and it was really nice to see the design work and the illustrations that came about as a result, because I really saw my brother and his friends in that. Whilst they're definitely are full of lots of propaganda, as Lisa was saying, you know, the superhero films that we now see nowadays, they're quite bombastic in the way that they, you know, explore a big idea. And so I found, you know, this big idea of the notion that you can kill people but not an idea, which is in the Martin Marprelate story and in mine. I found that this to be a great vessel to explore that, and also to take down the government in a short story. I thought, you know, in a superhero, you're gonna do it. So I actually went for it, didn't I?
And there was a lot of Alan Moore in your story. I felt.
I didn't know how I didn't know how else to do it. Actually, I didn't think small in the minutiae in some ways. I tried to incorporate that. Hopefully, in the kind of intimacies between the central character and his mother, and the interactions between the boys, between the teenagers. They wouldn't like to be called boys, would they? But yeah.
Yours was the one that went most wide, so to speak. It did go big.
It was scary to write it, actually, Ra. It was actually a bit scary to kind of go there, because I really don't like the Prime Minister in this story, and also in our current Prime Minister. And I think it was a great channel for anger.
I've got to say, I found the same thing. I was going to say that it was such a great channel for my anger, because I had so much fun, like having these brilliant women just kind of like mess with these kind of, you know, with these corrupt, politically adjacent men and chain stores and things like that, and just the mischievous nature of it, and just being able to, I don't know, just feel the excitement and the rush of them enacting just mischief and just taking things down. So yeah, I felt that same way. It was a really great way to channel rage and frustration.
It kind of brings me on to my next question, which was, you know, where do you normally, because even in these stories, you are putting a lid on it, aren't you? And how do you normally go about kind of, because you're obviously political beings, all of you, but where do you normally kind of, how do you normally kind of park your political feelings on something, and how did you keep a lid on it even here? Because you don't want it to become a rant, you don't want it to become polemic, you don't want to be writing just a political diatribe.
Yeah, it's difficult sometimes. It is difficult. But I think, Lisa, when you were saying about the micro and the macro, and even with my novels, they might be about these big, huge issues, but, you know, I write a whole novel and it would be set in somebody's living room and their friend's living room. And it's like, to them, that is the whole world. That is everything. And people read the book and then they say, oh, this is really political and you're really trying to shout about this issue and that issue. And I'm like, no, it's just about these people and their days, their life. Yeah, so you just shrink it down. All these huge, big issues and you shrink them down. I think that's how I write. I couldn't even think about tackling some of these huge subjects, but I can tackle them if I'm thinking about a group of people and how it affects them day to day. And that's how I approach this as well.
I feel you, Luan. That's exactly my approach as well. I think bringing it to the human, and you know, looking with empathy and compassion. And I'm the same. I can't really seem to write about these issues in what feels like is my truest voice, but it seems to be there in the start to blossom more and more in fiction. And I think I like to be thoughtful and exploratory, and for me writing is a way of thinking, so my politics is there in my writing, in my fiction especially, which I feel like is a truer space somehow, and a space where in which I can be exploratory and somehow not as polemical as I might come across when I speak my politics, because there's other spaces and dips and crevices and ways in which we can go against narratives, political narratives, and move in more subtle and exploratory ways in our fiction that it's harder to do when you write political non-fiction prose, which can also be amazing, but I'm not one of those skilled writers in that area.
Lisa, you're a very active activist. The word activist is sometimes, I think, perhaps possibly overused, but you're absolutely 100% genuine article activist. So how do you kind of balance your activism with your poetry and your writing? Do you try to keep them apart in terms of your headspace and the way in which you work when you're writing, or is there constant kind of traffic between the two?
Yeah, well, I recently wrote an essay called Practical Poetry, actually, that was released a few weeks ago, and it was about how these two things cannot be untethered, and how when I was writing my last book, I kept having to tell my editor. It was just after the Beirut blast, where on the 4th of August 2020, and I was in Lebanon, and I was functioning as I do, cross-border exchange of medicines, money and resources. And I was due to hand my manuscript in, and I kept kind of saying, I really am finding this very superfluous to requirement right now to write a book. It seems completely unnecessary in the world actually right now. And I really had to go through this process, because I couldn't not write a book because I was contracted. So I really had to go through this process of changing my relationship to poetry, and kind of went through a lot of conversations with my editor at the time about how that might look. And so I've kind of come up with this term called practical poetry, which is how any work that I put out into the world, how does it have kind of a circular economy, and how does it continue to function in the world in a necessary way? How does it generate funds, for example, for the daycare that I set up, for this, for that, for the other, so that it's actually existing in tandem constantly with my activism. Otherwise, I find it a lot of cognitive dissonance moving between the two things, sometimes within one day, sometimes within the same hour. And I think that, you know, as writers, as people with platforms, with voices, how do we recognize the currency of that, and how do we keep it in line with the vision of the world that we write about? How do we continue to create that with the words themselves? How do we really activate those words? And one of the questions I consistently ask myself is, how can this poem or this piece of writing be as useful as the grain of rice in times of crisis? Because a sack of a sack of rice is incredibly useful in times of crises. So this is the question I come back to often.
Thank you. We're kind of running out of time. We said the whole thing would be an hour. So I wanted to go back to Divya's story, and just to ask you, Divya, how you felt. Your story is all about a future deportation bill, which is not dissimilar to the Borders and Nationality Bill, and it's kind of, I guess, written on the to a certain extent in response to the Windrush scandals and other kind of repatriation sort of scandals. And I just wonder how you felt over the last couple of weeks with what's been happening with Ukrainian refugees and the sudden 180 or the sudden kind of welcoming or apparent welcoming of refugees, because it's quite ironic really reading your story in today's context.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? It's happened very recently. I just see it as an apparent welcoming. I'm very they haven't let many Ukrainian refugees into the UK. They're just doing some strange big talk.
Yeah,
that's what's going on. And yeah, and across, I mean, if you look at immigration policies from the 60s to the present day, there have been successive governments from the left and the right who have, weaponized racism, specifically against people of color, to, gain votes. I think the Conservative Party have just been trying to read what the population wants a bit more, and they're a bit warmer because the war's happening in Europe, which again makes me feel very disturbed. So I find I was thinking, this is interesting in the context of what I wrote in the story in the Windrush scandal was, not so long ago, but I just think it's part of political play, and it's to be read with a great deal of caution and awareness. And yeah, I'm afraid I'm quite cynical.
Cool. Last question really was, do you so with this project, obviously, many of the characters are kind of sort of already in the public domain, and a lot of the themes really about common ownership, and a later ambition of the project is to let other writers and graphic novelists and graphic artists kind of get their hands on the characters and do other things with the characters in these stories. And I know two of your characters, Divya, have been killed, but of the others, and of your character Luan, of the Lady Skimmington character Pausa, and of Lexi, what piece of advice would you each give to the next writer, if a writer comes along or a graphic artist comes along to work on that character? What would you tell them to do or to think about? Yeah.
Gosh.
What's most important to you about that character?
I don't know. Once I finish writing something and it's out there, I just think it's public, it's up for interpretation. So if someone was to read the story and come up with something completely different, I'd be really interested. Even when I saw the illustration of the character, I was like, wow, that's not how I pictured it at all, but I love it. So it's just cool to see what other people come up with. That's how I and people will come up with things that were never on your mind that really surprise you as well. So I would give no advice. Surprise me.
That's a nice answer. Yeah, for me, I think it would be the tenderness from which her power comes from. I think that's really central to Lexi's character. She's a very kind of bold, she's very bold, very brave, woman navigating her way through a world that's somehow against her, but it's all coming from this really exquisite tenderness. And there's such things that come to play in this story, such as radical family, which we see present in kind of, you know, working class women mothers, and how they create these radical families, though they'd never call it that. And I think there's all these kind of like secret politics, these politics that you don't say in those spaces because they make no sense when we use theoretical language, but how they're at play, and that they are born in these very kind of like strong, independent ways through an extreme tenderness and need of one another. So I'd really want that to stay central, I think.
Brilliant, thank you. Divya?
For me, I'm like, I'd give so much advice. I'd get right into all the advice. My characters, my story. I love giving advice anyway. My two main characters do die, but they are resurrected. And the grand theme of my short story is that you can kill people, but not an idea, not a great idea, not an idea that you know, one that can ignite in people's hearts and minds. And so the characters die, but they are resurrected. And so for me, you know, actually, you know, because I watch a lot of superhero stuff and I read a lot, so I was thinking, you know, how would this be if there were a sequel? I've just killed everyone off. But then I thought, you know, that how cool that a younger generation of creative activists would take the mantle, and, you know, just, you know, take that light and move forward with it. So I think that whoever works beyond these stories, there are so many more stories to tell about creative ways of protesting against corrupt governments. And the story goes global, and so, you know, I feel like writers could go global, and they could. The movement is global in my story, and so there's just endless options and possibilities beyond the story. I feel like that. It says at the end, you know, people are wearing masks with the main character, with one of the central characters' faces, Martin Marprelit, and they say, "I am Martin Marprelit," and someone in France says, "Je suis Martin Marprelit." Someone in you know, Delhi says, you know, in Hindi, that they are Martin Marprelit, and so everyone can be this character. And so, yeah, endless possibilities. But, you know, if they're asking for my advice, I'll give it to them.
I'll put them in touch. Well, thank you everybody for tonight. We've run out of time, but I just want to say personally, this has been the most fun book I think I've ever worked on. It's completely bonkers kind of an initial idea, but yeah, thanks for making it possible, and just making it such a fun read. So for everyone here tonight and watching, please also join me in thanking tonight's three speakers: Luan Goldie, Divya Ghelani. Thank you.